Thank you very much. I have to warn you, I have a terrible cough, so I have this stuff here that I'm going to spray in my mouth every now and then. It's to help me keep from coughing, and water, cough drops, all kinds of ammunition up here, but I might even have to leave in the middle and go cough for a while. So if that happens, Bob will take over. I'm sure he'll figure out something cool for you to do. I would love to, I passed out some paper, and if any of you need pencils, there are more pencils up here, just raise your hands and we can send those around. I'm going to ask you to just write a few things for me that I would love for you to turn in. This isn't a quiz. I don't care what your spelling is like. I hope I can read your handwriting. But if you could just take a moment now and put on the top of your page your name, if you wish, maybe what grade you're in, what you're really interested in, anything about you, because I don't know any of you. Do you need a pencil?
Yes, please. Thank you.
And this will be different than any notes that you're taking for your class, because I'm going to ask for them at the end. So just so you know that. Okay, this talk has a kind of funny title. I don't know if any of you noticed it. I didn't actually notice it till it was in the paper, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's called Edible Food and Sustainability. And I thought, oh, how did that happen? I should have checked something, and I didn't do it. I was busy. Because isn't food edible? I mean, yeah, I would think food is edible. That's what it is. It's something you eat. But as often happens with these funny kind of titles to talks, then you have to start thinking about it. Like, well, how can it's making lemonade out of lemons, you know? So I live out in the country on Road 41, and there are a lot of tankers on the road, and most of them have gasoline in them. But I was behind a tanker last week, and it happened to have a sign on it that said something like non-edible food. And I thought, yeah, I kind of went like you did. What on earth could that be? It's like non-potable water. It's something that's food stuff, but you can't eat it. And so I started thinking, what might be some examples of non-edible food? So I came up with a bunch of them. I'm just going to try them out on you. First of all, there's food that's edible for one group of people, but not for another. So, for example, pork is not an edible food for Muslims and Jews who practice dietary laws, but it's a #1 food for lots of other people in the world. Or guinea pigs would not be considered edible foods for most Americans, right? Because they're pets, first of all, and also they're just not something we eat. But they're a real important food in Peru. Meat is not considered edible for vegetarians, and eggs and dairy foods aren't edible for vegans. Wheat isn't edible for those who have a gluten intolerance. So there's lots of examples. Other kinds of non-edible foods might be foods that people are ignorant of or people have lost their taste for. So I'm going to mention offal. Do you all know what offal is? Does anybody know? No. Okay, that's the part of animals that's not muscle tissue. It's kidneys, it's lungs, it's tongue, it's all those other parts. And yeah, does that sound good to you? Uh-huh, I didn't think so. None of you have eaten food like that. Maybe some of you have. Liver? No? Anything? Yes? Pardon me? It is good. But when I was 2 generations ago, those were very, very common foods that you bought in supermarkets. They weren't ethnic foods. Today, you'd have to go to a really great Mexican restaurant or an ethnic restaurant to find those kinds of meats. They're not something we eat anymore, although there's a lot of chefs who are trying to bring that back into their restaurants. Non-edible foods could also refer to other kinds of unused foods like cuts of meat that take a really long time to cook, or slow-cooking beans and slow-cooking grains. Because we live in a pretty fast-moving world, people like to cook steaks, hamburger, chicken breasts, things that don't take very much time. So old-fashioned roasts, bean dishes, grain dishes, foods that take planning and forethought, probably are not considered very edible foods or approachable foods. How many of you in your households have parents, unless you cook yourself, which I'd love to know about later on, I'm going to ask you, who make roasts or briskets or cook beans from scratch? Oh, some of you do. Good. Great, okay. But most of you don't, because that's food that's kind of gone out of fashion. Now, spoiled food, of course, would be an example of non-edible food. Perhaps that tanker was filled with that tainted peanut butter, or tainted beef or something, I don't know. But many oils and nuts that we eat are actually rancid, and therefore really bad for you because of the free radicals in rancid oils. And they should be considered inedible. On the other hand, there's lots of foods that are really strange and funky that we might consider rotten and inedible, but other people love. I was in Norway for Christmas, and I was served a specialty, two specialties. One was called rotefiske. That means rotten fish. And it's basically salmon that's been buried in the ground until it ferments and breaks down. Now, that just sounded so horrible to me, and I had to eat it because I was a guest, right? It was delicious, but the idea of it wasn't so tasty. Another thing I had to eat was a wild bird that had been hung to decompose. Now, it's normal to do that for a short time, but this had been done for weeks and weeks. I considered it completely rotten food. And I thought it tasted pretty terrible, but it was a delicacy in the home I was in. So sometimes those lines of what's spoiled and what's not can cross over, but some spoiled food is really bad for us and we shouldn't eat it, and we usually know. And lastly, non-edible foods could be, and this is what we're going to kind of talk about today, and they are for me just stuff we shouldn't be eating, even if other people do. Now, this is a science cafe, but this is a totally unscientific, completely personally biased list of foods. Now, this is my list, and I'm going to ask you to make your list. I'm just stating my opinion of foods that I don't want to eat because I think they get in the way of having sustainable, more wholesome foods. So my list goes like this: high fructose corn syrup, which is basically in everything, inverse sugars and fats, highly refined foods, fruit from New Zealand and Chile, asparagus from Peru, in other words, food that's from really far away, feedlot beef, CAFO pork, mass-produced chickens, animals treated with hormones and antibiotics for growth, food that knowingly abuses people as well as animal, food that harms the environment, BST hormone-treated cows, non-organic butter, farm-raised salmon, endangered or rare species of fish, produce that comes packed in plastic clamshells. I will not buy it, even though I really want what's in there. The kinds of things that aren't on my list are foods that I've carried home from far away. I figure if I've gone somewhere, I can carry them home and they don't count. They're my personal importing business, except that I don't sell it. Olive oil, because I love olive oil, coffee and chocolate. Those are three foods that kind of break some of these rules. And then I'm not concerned about health issues. This is not about full fat or non-fat dairy food. That's a very personal thing, and it doesn't affect anybody. Do I stick to this 100%? Well, I don't. It's actually very hard to. I can't. But I try really hard, and I come pretty close. But I'm going to tell you later why it's not so easy. So what I'd like you to do right now is take a few minutes and write down on your piece of paper some foods that you might consider non-edible foods, foods that you don't buy for any reason, foods you don't want to eat. It can be for taste, it can be for, some of the reasons I just gave. You don't think that they're sustainable or good for the environment or good for you. Maybe put 10 things on your list if you can. Ears, guys. I can't shout over you, so I know once we start doing stuff, it kind of gets out of hand. But I don't know people your age. I don't know very many people your age, and I'm really interested in how you see the world of food. So I'm going to ask you some questions, and I really want to hear from you. So shout out your answers. Don't wait. I'm not going to call on anybody. It's not really a classroom. So how many of you eat? Raise both hands. Nobody eats? How many of you eat? All right. Now, do you eat? Come on, raise your hands. I want to see that. Because if you don't, you're a ghost. Thank you. All right. How many of you like to eat? Yeah? Okay. Some of you don't like to eat. Is that so? Are there some of you who don't? Hey, quiet. Bob, you got to help me because I can't shout. Okay. What do you like about eating? Now tell me, some of you speak out and tell me what you like about it. Flavor, taste, what else? Texture. What?
What was it?
Smell. Okay, so the senses, texture, taste, smell. What else? Anything else? Bringing people together. All right. Okay, so tell me what some of you have had for breakfast this morning. What did you have for breakfast? Cereal, waffles, what else? Pop-Tarts. Pancakes. All right. Eggs? Did anybody have eggs? Burritos? You had eggs? Okay. Okay. Now tell me, do you eat with your family every day? No? Not even once? Really? Not even with dinner? You don't eat with your family? How many eat dinner with your family? Raise your hands. Not even half. Okay, sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. Okay, do any of you know how to cook? Great. Raise your hands high so I can see you. All right.
I know how to cook.
Thank you.
How many of you know how to cook?
What do you cook?
What do you cook? What kinds of things do you prepare?
Cake? Chicken? Can you help me facilitate it?
So what's the next thing?
No, just I want to hear more answers. What do you cook? I want to hear that. What?
What's it?
Fried chicken. Fried
okay.
chicken.
What
What
you
else?
Calamari?
Calamari. Ramen noodles. Okay. Okay. Now, enchiladas. Okay. All right. Now, those of you who don't cook, would you like to learn to cook? Would
For
you
those
like?
of you who don't cook, how many
Thank
of you
you.
would like to learn how to cook?
So just 5 of you. All right. Where would you go to learn? Who would teach you?
Where would you go to learn to cook? At home, or would you go somewhere else? From a friend or a class at school?
Ah, okay. Grandma. Okay. Okay.
Experiment? That's what a lot of cooking is experiment.
Experiment. It is for sure. Okay. How many of you grew up on a farm?
How many of you grew up on a farm?
1, 2. Did you?
Only 2 of you? 3?
Okay. How many of you have parents who grew up on a
How
farm?
many of you have parents who grew up on a farm?
Okay, a little bit. How about grandparents who grew up on a farm?
Grandparents who grew up on a farm.
Ah, we get a little bit more. Okay. How many of you have ever been to a farm?
How many of you have been to a farm?
Wow. Did you go on a field trip or something? No?
Field trip, or did you go for some other reason?
How many of you have been to the farmer's market? Wow. Now that's fantastic. Great. Have any of you ever harvested your own food? This
Have
could
any of
be
you ever harvested your own food?
not the grocery store. You can pick an apple from a tree, pull a carrot. Okay, a handful of you have. Okay. I'm going to let you do these just to start here. 16.
Okay. Do you have concerns about the food you eat? Do you worry that it might be harmful to you or for the environment? How many are worried about that? Raise your hand. How many are not so worried about that? More people are worried than not worried, I would say. Okay. Are you concerned about your health? How many are? How many of you are not so concerned about your health or don't think about it? Okay. Do you think that the way you eat is sustainable? How many think so? Or try to do that? Not so many. Well, we don't just mean sustainable by whether or not you're alive. We mean a much broader thing than that.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
All right.
If for some reason, climate, terrorism, drought, there were no foods left in the supermarket, how would you feed yourself? What would your resources be? So let's have a few answers. Over here, let's have an answer or two. What do you think? What? Okay.
Hunting, okay.
All right. How about over here? Does anybody have an answer over here? Back there. Gathering. Okay. You do what? Okay. All right. Anybody else? Okay. Have you ever had a meal where you could identify who grew each thing on your table, or even a part of it? How many of you have been at a meal where you knew how the food was prepared?
Okay.
Quite a few of you. When it comes to food, and now we're going to have to do this a little bit at a time, a few people at a time. When it comes to food, what issues are important to you? These could be taste, health, pleasure, independence and self-reliance, local, organic, sustainable, security, or fair trade. So we can ask you if you have a response to that, any of you? Okay. Anybody else? Over here? Less expensive, okay?
Okay.
Yeah. Health and local.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Fair trade. Okay.
Great. Okay, we can stop there.
Okay. So now
Thank you so much. All right, so now I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. Not because I'm particularly interesting, but because my life experience might serve as a way of measuring how much has changed about food. And now it may seem like there's a million years between your age and mine, but from where I stand, it's not so far. So when I was in high school, or junior high, which I guess you guys are, I could cook many things, including baking bread. I learned to bake and cook from both my mother and my father. I even had a cookbook or two of my own. We all had dinner together every single night. I don't remember not eating with my family. We had a vegetable garden and about 20 fruit trees, so we ate pretty locally for a good part of the year. I grew up on a farm, then in a farming community. There were no genetically modified organisms in any of our food. There wasn't even much of a distinction between organic and conventional foods. I mean, the distinction was there, but people didn't think about it except kind of eccentric people. My father happened to be one of those eccentric people, and he thought, and he was a botanist, that organic would prove to be better than what we call conventional farming. We had soft drinks twice a year for a celebration, for a special occasion. We never had chips or white bread or Fritos, or any of that stuff that's over there because it was too expensive. Cheetos, whatever, I like Cheetos. It was too expensive and it wasn't considered good for us. We never had fast food because, well, partly because there wasn't much of it, but we went to the A&W maybe, A&W, you know that, root beer stand once a year or so. We never ate out because people didn't do that unless my parents went out for a special event. Words like local and seasonal, sustainable, fair trade weren't spoken because there was no context for them, at least none that we knew of. They didn't really exist. There were hardly any, I mean, compared to today, there were very few processed foods. TV dinners was about as swift as it got, right? And frozen food. There were no microwaves to microwave them in, so you had to heat the oven, so it took a little while. Lots of kids brought their lunch to school. And the lunch that was served at school was typically pretty terrible, but it was cooked there, and it was a hot lunch, and it was probably somewhat better than a lot of the school lunches you have today, except at Monte del Sol, where you have a cook who's cooking lunch. Anyway, I could go on, but I think you see that there's a very big difference between eating when I was in high school and now when you are. To me, the difference has to do with the fact that we've progressively been losing our way as human animals. If you think that animals draw sustenance from their habitat and they know exactly where everything is and how it works and where to find certain things, we don't even know the terrain that we call home. We depend nearly 100% on people we don't know, on processes that we don't understand in order to eat, nor can we duplicate those processes. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie King Corn, but if you get a chance, you can actually rent it. It's in the video libraries. These kids just out of college made a movie about corn in the Midwest, the whole corn business. And they just tried to make high fructose corn syrup. You know, they had a very, very fast mumbled formula on the phone, and they tried to do it. And they came up with something that was sort of like corn syrup, but it's a really funny process to watch. I mean, it's just not something you can, you know, they say don't try this at home. You can't do it at home. Probably none of us would be able to raise something to eat from our own environment if we had to. It's a pretty sorry state, actually. A nutritionist friend of mine just sent me a quiz that evaluates one's independence with regards to food. Excuse me, I'm going to have to go for the water. So as you might guess, the most self-reliant score comes from people who take responsibility for sourcing and preparing and preserving their own foods. And probably because of your age, you would fall in the opposite end of the least independent score, because you're pretty dependent on other people to get food for you, cook food for you, buy it for you, and so forth. But that's going to change because you're going to grow up and you're going to be out in the world and no one's going to be doing it for you anymore one day. Today, the whole business of food and farming is basically, I think, is an extractive kind of industry, very much like mining or drilling. Modern food production consumes a lot of materials: soil, water, petroleum, and minerals. And there's lots of problems with our food systems that you know about, that it travels so far, that we have a lot of dietary diseases. And I'm skipping over some of this because I want to read some things to you that are more exciting. So with all the problems we have in our food system, how can we connect the dots? Does anybody do this for us? Well, I found this great book. It's called Stuff, The Secret Life of Everyday Things. Somebody just lent it to me. And this little book is just a tiny bit out of date, but it basically breaks down bikes, cars, shoes, computers, and the hamburger. Cheeseburger. Somebody mentioned cheeseburgers. So I'm going to read to you what goes into a cheeseburger and what goes into a Coke. And we'll skip the potatoes, the bun, and everything else, but I think you'll find it interesting. So, a quarter-pound patty of USDA choice beef probably came from a steer that grazed for the first year of its life on independent private lands in the Midwestern United States. But it's also possible that that steer grazed on public lands in the West. That would be New Mexico. There, cattle have left about 10% of the arid lands desertified, which means desert, barren, and about 2/3 substantially degraded. Streamside habitats, cornerstones of arid landscapes, have especially suffered. Now, I do want to say that that bleak picture is often painted of cattle in the West. It's not entirely true. Here in New Mexico, we have some really amazing ranchers who have restored their habitat and their grasslands and their streams and all that, and they work with the Quivira Coalition here in town, and they're fantastic. And so it's not all black and white. There's shades of gray. But after a year, wherever your steer was from, it probably rode in a cattle car to a feedlot, and then it spent 6 months eating corn and soybeans and sorghum and barley, all grains. Now, if it was in New Mexico, say it was a steer that grew 50 miles from here, maybe up in Pecos someplace, it probably went to Amarillo, and then it went to Kansas, where it was slaughtered and the meat was packaged. And then that meat was sent to Utah to a great big, distribution center, and then it came here. That's a trip of 3,000 miles to eat New Mexican beef. 3,000 miles. Now, all those trucks went back empty somewhere, so you have to double the miles. So that's 6,000 miles to eat something that was raised possibly 50 miles from here. Unless you went to the farmer's market and you got some beef that was actually grown and raised in Pecos, and you're buying it right where it was growing, practically. So let's talk about the grain. In the feedlot, workers driving heavy machinery spread the feed mixture in troughs that are as long as whole city blocks. The steer nuzzled into a trough and ate. Every 1.2 pounds of feed it ate turned into another quarter-pound burger. Okay? Feedlots and animal raisers feed more than 70% of the U.S. grain harvest to livestock each year. The largest share goes to cattle. U.S. livestock eat 60% of the nation's corn harvest, or about 1/4 of all the corn grown in the world. Now, these figures are going to be different because of what? Do you know? Biofuel, right? Corn is being now grown for biofuel to make ethanol. It may be very efficient, it may not go on forever, but it is driving the price of grains very, very high, and that means the price of your hamburger. The pound of corn that was required to make your hamburger grew on 6 square feet of former prairie in Nebraska. Monoculture fields have replaced virtually all the native grasslands on the American plains, which may be why it's so boring to drive through Nebraska and Kansas and all those states. If you've ever driven through them, they're kind of beautiful, but it's really all the same for, hundreds and hundreds of miles. The cornfield is owned by a distant corporation and managed by local contractors. It's sprayed with fertilizers, irrigation water, and pesticides, including atrazine. Atrazine is the most heavily applied pesticide in U.S. agriculture, and it's the second most commonly detected pesticide in wells, in drinking wells, like we have in our yards. If ingested, atrazine promotes the formation of hormones that are linked with breast cancer and other hormonal diseases, particularly for women. To produce the quarter-pound hamburger required as much energy as a cup of gasoline. Some of the energy was used in the feedlot for transportation, but some of it went to fertilizing the feed. Nitrogen fertilizer is essentially congealed natural gas. It comes from Texas, from a Texas chemical plant. It's heated methane from natural gas to form hydrogen, which is then compressed and superheated, and then nitrogen from distilled air is added, and you end up with ammonia. You know what ammonia is? Have you ever smelled ammonia? It's really a bad smell. The U.S. economy consumes nearly a pound of ammonia per person per day, mostly as fertilizer. Now, this goes on and on and on. It's really quite fascinating, but it's also quite technical. I'll skip over just to say that a lot of this ammonia is percolated down into the groundwater, and then into streams, and then into rivers, like the Mississippi River. And if you follow the Mississippi River to the Gulf, you may know that there's a huge dead zone in the growth where nothing grows, nothing lives, no oysters, no shellfish, none of the things we used to like to eat from there, because this nitrous ammonia oxide creates an algae growth which deprives oxygen to other things that are living beneath it. So by eating a quarter-pound hamburger, we also cause the loss of 5 times the paddy's weight in topsoil. Half of the U.S. cropland is planted with hay, grains, and other crops to feed livestock. Hay is a soil-conserving ground cover, but row crops such as corn and soybeans are not. They leave the soil exposed and susceptible to erosion by wind and rain. So then we can go on to the bun, to the condiments, to the ketchup, and all of that kind of stuff. But what I think is really interesting, especially for us to think about, because we live in such an incredibly dry place, which has been drier than usual this winter, is that to produce this hamburger, your beef needed 616 gallons of water. That's a lot of water. And the cheese that went on it took 56 gallons of water. The bun took 25. The ketchup, 3.2. The tomato, 1.8 gallons. And the lettuce, which is practically like eating water itself, 1.3 gallons of water. So to have a cheeseburger, it involves a lot of consumption. It's not just the thing you're looking at. It's a lot of water. It's a lot of soil loss. It's a lot of soil degradation. So I know, what can you do? I mean, some people might want to think of some options, like never have a cheeseburger again, or maybe just have them once in a while. That's something for you to think about. Now, I want to just go in a little bit to the Coca-Cola. But this could really be anything that you're drinking out of a can, because I found this pretty, I mean, I'm just learning this to talk to you, and I found it pretty amazing. So, starting with a Coca-Cola, you've got what? High fructose corn syrup. That's that stuff made from corn processing that you can't do in your own kitchen. And it has pesticides and stuff in it too. A milling plant used water, enzymes, acids, heat, grinders, and centrifuges to turn corn kernels into starch and then into corn syrup. Making syrup is the second largest use of corn in North America. Feeding livestock is the largest. On average, Americans consume, do you have any idea? 48 pounds of corn syrup a year. That's a heck of a lot of corn syrup, which is sugar. To make my soda, the bottling plant combined corn syrup, citric acid, and flavor concentrate. That's the secret recipe. Preservatives, caffeine, and artificial coloring. First with water, then with carbon dioxide. The same corn milling plant in Iowa fermented corn to make the carbon dioxide. The caffeine was a byproduct of making decaffeinated coffee. Okay, so far so good. We've just got the beverage. Now we're going to go to the can. Bauxite. My cola was in an aluminum can weighing 15 grams, which is about a half an ounce. 5 grams was recycled from melted down cans and scrap, the kind you put in your landfill. The other 10 grams began as 40 grams of bauxite ore, which was mined in Australia in the outback. Massive machines with 15-foot high tires and shovels big enough to scoop up a car strip mine the ore from a thin layer of underground rock. Bauxite mining destroys more surface area than any other kind of mining there is. Near the mine, the bauxite was crushed, washed, pulverized, mixed with caustic soda from California, heated, pressurized, settled, filtered, and roasted with calcium oxide from Japan. This yielded aluminum oxide, a powder known as alumina, which looks like wet sugar. Most of the caustic soda was captured for reuse. The process also created all this red mud, a skin-burning mixture of oxidized metals and other contaminants that stayed right there in Australia. Pipes siphoned the mud into a settling pond where a fraction of it leached into the groundwater. A Korean freighter hauled the alumina across the Pacific Ocean to a wall of breakers to the Columbia River. Now that is an amazing place where the Columbia River meets the ocean. It's the roughest piece of water in the world. I saw it last summer. It's just amazing. So for any boat to get through there, it has to be navigated with satellites, computers, and all of this. It's also heavily dredged, which stirs up DDT and a lot of other toxic materials and puts them into wetlands and destroys the habitat for the birds and animals that live there. Then this is all smelted, and smelting, okay, I know, we have to go on because you can't be here all night, but smelting is like just some of the worst news in metal manufacturing. Few processes, it says, are as damaging to the global climate as aluminum smelting. It's so energy intensive that aluminum earned the nickname congealed electricity. So making a soda can of smelted aluminum takes the energy equivalent to a quarter can of gasoline. Now that's just one can, remember. Quarter doesn't sound like very much, a quarter can, but we're talking about only one can of Coke. My 33% recycled can took about 1/6 of a can of gasoline in energy. And then the smelters run on huge amounts of electricity. To get that electricity, they've drained the Snake River, diverted it. When the water goes back into it, it's so warm that the wild salmon that come up that river can't live. They die. Now, basically, most of the wild salmon has died in the Northwest because of this kind of thing. Now, health people will tell you the best food you can eat, and you should eat it all the time, is wild salmon, because it has these wonderful qualities of fat that we need. But it's very, very expensive. We're all going to have to be incredibly wealthy to, you can go to Whole Foods, it's $24.99 a pound. It's not exactly available, partly because of things like aluminum smelters. So, my gosh, that's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, you know, imagine any single thing that you eat and what goes into it and what made its container, and you probably would stop eating. I mean, I just find it alarming. So in short, agriculture and meat production does what? It uses a lot of water. Often the water is contaminated with pesticides. Think of those big accumulated runoffs that create the dead zones in the Gulf, or huge lagoons of animal waste that also filter down into groundwater. Sometimes they break and enter streams directly. It takes a lot of electricity to not only make cans and things, but to do things like, you know, when you buy broccoli at the store, if you ever look at a box that says, okay to top ice, that means that broccoli is picked, immediately refrigerated, ice is put on top, and it's kept cold for sometimes weeks before you eat it. That all takes a lot of electricity. Food manufacturing itself uses a lot of petroleum in the form of what? Plastics, you know, that go into excessive packaging, and a lot of that can't be recycled. Where land is tilled as an annual crop, such as those corn and soybeans and barley in the Midwest, soil is lost to the air and carried away. This is such a big problem that there's actually an old kind of agriculture that has been brought back. It's called no-till, and you can probably guess what that is. It means instead of tilling up the ground from scratch each time to plant a crop, just a hole is made and the seed is put in. And then the plants that are already there, as they die, because they're annual plants, they just become fertilizer. So it's much more efficient. It takes much less equipment to do that. It doesn't disturb the soil as much. In Kansas, there's something called the Land Institute. And quite a remarkable scientist has been working for the last 30 years to using the prairie, the little piece of prairie that's left with all these amazing grasses on it. He's been trying to figure out how to take annual plants. Do you know what annual plants are? They're plants that you have to plant every single year. They only live for 1 year. You plant a seed, it comes up, it makes some wheat, and then it dies, and that's it. You turn it into the soil. Perennials last for a long time, many, many years. So the prairie was made of perennial plants, mainly. So he's been studying prairie plants and trying to figure out how to turn wheat, which is an annual and a huge, huge crop in the world, into a perennial. I've been listening to him give talks for about 20 years, and I just heard him speak last week, and he has finally succeeded in making a perennial wheat crop. This would be an incredible boon to any industrial economy, but it's a very, very, very slow process to do this. He brought a sample of this plant to a lecture he gave. So here's the top part. You have the leaves coming up, and then you have the stalks with the wheat on it, the heads of wheat. Now, in an annual plant that's planted, the root part's only about this big. In his plant that he brought in, the roots were 7 feet long. They were like over my shoulder down, like a big robe or something. I mean, it's huge. And with that many roots drawing nutrients in the soil, that wheat has got to be really powerful stuff. Okay. So anyway, those are some exciting things that are on the horizon, but they're still pretty small. So I asked myself, and I hope you ask, how can we think about eating sustainably when everything we eat is so complicated and it draws from so many different sources, you know, to exist at all? So I was just reading on the internet this week a wonderful definition by a rancher who grows like 6,000 acres of wheat in South Dakota. His name is Fred Kirschman, and he's written a definition. I'm going to read it to you, and maybe I'll even read it twice, but this is kind of what I'd like to work with and thinking about it with you. He says, most current efforts to define sustainable food systems assume that there's a steady state situation. In other words, nothing is really changing. But if we just kind of tweak and make some little changes to our food system so that it causes less pollution, promotes conservation, regulates food safety more effectively, and includes more of the ingredients that a healthy diet requires, then it will be sustainable. But he goes on to say, Nothing could be further from the truth. Why? Because nature is full of emergent properties. In other words, it's changing all the time. And so that means sustainability has to be something that is always emerging and changing as well. Sustainability, he says, is about maintaining something indefinitely into the foreseeable future. That's kind of a definition. We add, we don't just take, we add back to a system so that it will go on for our children and grandchildren and on into the future. So consequently, to be sustainable, we have to anticipate and successfully adapt to changes ahead. Sustainability is a process. It's not a prescription. This process always requires social and ecological as well as economic dimensions. There is, therefore, no simple definition of what to do. It's a journey that we embark on together. It's not a formula on which we agree. So that's a long way of saying, hey, if we're talking about sustainability in food systems, remember, we're talking about agriculture. Agriculture is what could be harder to do than be a farmer. You never know if you're going to get your rain. You don't know when you're going to get your hailstorm, if your crop's going to be destroyed, if there's going to be a late freeze, is it going to be a dry year? I mean, you know, if you know anybody who farms, there's a reason they're always talking about the weather. Their lives depend on it. Our lives depend on it. So when we're talking about food, we have to take a step back. It's not just the hamburger. It's the meat, it's the wheat, it's the corn, it's everything. And this is all subject to change. So we need to be able to anticipate some of that change and adapt to it. So do any of you have ideas about, thoughts about what that change might look like? What kind of changes are we coming up against that might affect or define, help us define sustainability? Pardon me? Passive what? Acid rain. Oh, we haven't talked about that for a long time, but yeah, it's still there. Climate change. Yeah. Any other ideas? Yes.
Decrease of available fossil fuels for the way that we've been practicing.
Yeah. Peak oil. How about water? How about water? You know, we're sort of starting to warm up and dry up here on the planet, so water might be important too. I think that to kind of get into this, it might be useful to make some assumptions, see what assumptions we can make about how we treat food and agriculture in the food system. So I made a list, and please, if you have other ideas, feel free to add to it, because I'd like to, you know, think about this together. One assumption we've made is, as you mentioned, there's plenty of oil to move food around for energy. There's plenty of oil for pesticides and fertilizers, which is what it's based on. It's a petroleum product, basically. There's plenty of oil for long-distance shipping, for, you know, fruits from Australia, and so on and so forth. Another assumption is there's ample water for all the processing that we need to do or think we want to do. Another assumption is that chemical pollution in the form of pesticides leaching into groundwater and food and lakes and streams is not a problem. Well, I don't know. I mentioned the atrazine, and that's just one of many. I think that's a problem probably for a lot of women. As Americans, an assumption we have is that we can eat whatever we want all the time. There's even a motto in a restaurant in Santa Fe that says something like, all the food all the time. I mean, you know, there's sort of no limits. You want to have blueberries? You can go get blueberries. You can go to any store in Santa Fe and find blueberries. They came from New Zealand, but you can have them. Blackberries, strawberries, same thing. It doesn't matter. We're fine to think about our food being grown in other countries. That's an assumption we have. We're comfortable with that. We think weather is predictable. We think that food should be cheap. We think that food from other countries should and can be even cheaper, even though it's grown at high risk to those working in fields and farms and to the environment. We put a big emphasis on efficiency, big fields, big machinery, huge feedlots. Big farms take fewer people than smaller farms. That model of efficiency we're very in love with. Reducing labor costs. We assume it's all right to submit animals to horrible conditions. which we do on a regular basis. We assume that annual crops are preferred to perennial crops because that's mostly what we grow. We're comfortable with excessive packaging in food. We have supermarkets absolutely full of it. Frozen foods are cool. We like that. We don't think about the fact it takes a huge amount of electricity to freeze foods and keep them frozen. Combining huge batches of processed foods, such as ground beef, makes sense. It's efficient. That's another one of our assumptions. Even though when something goes wrong, it's harder to trace when there's a problem. And the result of that is that it's huge, dangerous, and wasteful. We don't seem to act as if wildlife habitat is important. We've destroyed most of the habitat for wild salmon, as I mentioned, even though it's supposed to be one of the healthiest foods. It's acceptable to grow food for fuel instead of for people. That's what we're doing in the Midwest right now with ethanol. We've accepted pretty much GMOs, the use of hormones and antibiotics used to stimulate growth, a bovine growth hormone for cattle to solve all kinds of problems. We think it's all right to destroy through development and for poor farming practices our most fertile croplands. Never mind that it's been predicted we're going to lose, between 8 and 20% of today's food-producing land by 2050. That's just 40 years from now. You're still going to be around. While there's 200,000 more people that need to be fed each day by the dwindling number of farmers that exist. We think this is all right because the answer is food can come from somewhere else. We also think that monoculture is good. 90% of Idaho's potatoes, which are grown for McDonald's, they're all the same kind of potato. They're russet Burbanks, a great potato. But it's not the only potato. There are hundreds and hundreds of kinds of potatoes. The Midwest is associated with corn, soybeans, and wheat. Go to Napa Valley, all you see are wine grapes. We're very big on monocropping systems. So if these are some assumptions, then we can ask, well, what's changing? What's changing is we're running out of oil. It's a limited resource. Can't fuel the same kind of system we've been having. Water is now being viewed as a dwindling resource. Aquifers that we have mined, like the Ogallala aquifer, are emptying. We're using old water to grow basically food for raising beef for your hamburger. Chemical pollution is a big problem everywhere. I already mentioned the Gulf Stream and the dead zone and atrazine. Maybe we can't have everything all the time. What's going to move it from here to there if we don't have a lot of oil? I think people more and more are learning the values of seasonal eating, which means local foods. It makes a different kind of foodscape. Relying on other countries to grow our food and get it to us seems like a highly risky proposition. No animal would think of doing that. I mean, are you really sure that it's going to get to you? I wouldn't trust it. Relying on, weather is no longer predictable. Flooding, drought, high winds. This is the new weather. This is what's coming with global warming. Food is not cheap. We say we want cheap food, we expect it, but there are huge, vast, hidden costs to getting cheap foods into stores that need to be recognized and are more and more being recognized by people. And that has to do with health, environment, subsidies, roads, all kinds of things. Food grown outside the country is often cheaper, and that's also commensurate with a very low standard of living, very low wages paid to workers in other countries. It's also grown at a high cost to the environment. Coffee plantations, for example, beef in South America, both kinds of farming where the rainforest has been cut down to grow things that we eat. Efficiency, I think, is highly overrated and comes at a high price, which includes the loss of diversity, a lack of regional identity, loss of habitat, and loss of character. Our food doesn't have much character anymore. You know, there's so much incredible diverse food and taste and all kinds of things out there, but mostly the food we're looking at is pretty bland. Another assumption that I think is changing is that it's not all right to submit animals and poultry, pigs, cattle, whatever they are, to really horrible conditions of life, which they are. Anyway, I can go on and on with these. I won't do that, but I will just go to the last one, which is to say that biodiversity is essential for life in both animals and the plant world. That there is no one size fits all. There's not just one potato or one kind of beef or one chicken. Relying on monocrops has always been a dangerous game of roulette. And local food systems, if we ever develop them, will not need tomatoes and peaches that can be shipped, that have to be shipped long distances. Local food systems can consider the best breed of animal for our land, not for the general sort of market. So I see one of the ways in which sustainability might be reflecting change is going towards specificity. We live in New Mexico. There are actually animals like the churro lamb, like Corriente cattle, who have been here since the Spanish came. They're well adapted, you know, to drought, to this land. They're small. They don't do much damage. You know, they have many advantages. They're appropriate in small numbers for this kind of location, whereas a big Hereford and Angus is just not. I mean, these are English animals. They're not really appropriate for the dry Southwest. So this kind of thing may not be what Dr. Kirschman had in mind, but there's some of the factors that I'm looking at towards change. And they're essentially based on perceived changes in resources, in weather, and also us, as consumers, our ideas about what is acceptable consuming behavior. And if we start by recognizing that farming is in transition because of peak oil and possibly peak water, then we can't continue to farm the way industrial farming has led us, which is petroleum-based and which brings, through its practices, depletion of the soil and the releasing of CO2 into the air. Perhaps what we really need to do, I think, is look at older models of farming and perhaps, you know, bring them up to date in a new way. For example, smaller models of farms, like in Iowa, the way farms used to be, always had animals in conjunction with crops. They grew a diverse number of crops. People were able to make a lot of different things and offer and sell a lot of different things from one farm. If our technology can no longer support enormous fields, enormous machineries, long-distance shipping, then I think to be sustainable, we're going to have to look at smaller farm models that are connected to our regions, to our water systems, to our food sheds, our watersheds where we live. It's going to be a lot more fun. I promise you, the food's going to be a lot better. Instead of having everything all the time, I'll tell you, when asparagus comes in, like it will, you know, in May, yes, we're just going to eat asparagus till it comes out our ears. It's that good, you know, and then it's gone. And then we go to the next thing. It's a different way of living, you know, I think. I think that another kind of form of sustainable growing, maybe the most sustainable, is backyard gardens. People growing their own food. I know that, do any of you garden or have a garden in your house? Okay, a few of you do. That's great. That's wonderful, because there's been a huge, huge interest now in backyard gardening. And I think the whole idea of the victory garden from the First World and Second World War has really come back and become something people are pretty interested in. I'm on a board of something called the Seed Savers Exchange, and we sell seeds. And our seed sales have gone through the roof the last 3 years because people are starting to garden again. During World War II, people like you, your parents, grew 50% of all the fruits and vegetables that they ate in their backyards. Now, we actually get from other countries more than 50% of all the fruits and vegetables we eat. It's quite a different portrait. But people can still grow. They can learn to do it. It does mean changing our lives a bit, that's for sure. So what would you do? What would you do to start knowing some of these things, to think about eating a little bit more sustainably? I'll tell you some ideas I have, and then you can tell me some that you have. Plan on learning to cook, okay? Just learn to cook a few basic foods. What do you like? Do you like spaghetti and tomato sauce? Learn to cook it. Enchiladas, it doesn't matter. But learn to cook something. It's a lot more affordable than going out. You'll have much more to say about what you're eating. It's much more delicious, and it will let you become a very self-reliant human being instead of totally dependent on others. Plus, it's fun, and you can share. You can do it with other people. When you cook, choose food that's locally grown as much as possible. Now, I'll leave that to you to define local. Some people say 100 miles, some pay 250. We might say the Southwest, we might say the Rio Grande watershed. There's lots of ways to describe local, but it probably doesn't include Chile, Spain, places like that. Choose food that's in season where you live. That's the same as local, by the way, because it will generally taste better, it's going to be more alive, and doing so you will support your local communities. I would suggest avoiding foods whose production has harmed people, animals, wildlife, water, or other aspects of the environment, because one is, it's just not nice to harm other creatures. And two is when we do that, we're really ultimately harming ourselves and making it very hard for us to continue our lives. This would eliminate meats from factory farms, highly processed foods that have a lot of that corn syrup in them, lots of excess packaging in food. You'll look at it a little differently when you go to the store. In choosing foods that we don't raise, like coffee and chocolate, I'll bet a lot of people aren't too eager to give up chocolate and coffee. Look for those that are fair trade, certified, or organic, or bird friendly, something that really promotes the environment. And, oh my gosh, I have so many things, but I see that there's a light flashing, so I have to stop. I was going to suggest that you try making bread. You know, if you go to the store and you notice that good bread, and you may not do this because your parents do the shopping, but a loaf of bread is about $4. Nice whole wheat bread, $4 or more. If you want that, try making your own. It's easy, it's fun. I made a loaf today, kind of in between writing this talk and doing things. It cost me about $1 to make 2 loaves of really wholesome bread, all organic ingredients. But there's a catch. Before I left the house, I thought, I wonder where those ingredients come from. And so I got them all off the shelf and I looked. Oh, it's shocking. I see if I can remember where they come from. The salt came from Spain. I used some honey that somebody gave me. It came from central India. How many miles is that? That's a lot of miles. Now, I didn't buy that honey, but somebody else is going to buy it because it's a group that's trying to sell this honey. All the flowers, and I used about 4 or 5 different kinds of flowers, came from Canada, or the label said North America. North America usually means Canada, I've learned, because I look these things up on the internet. The yeast came from Mexico. Who would have thought? Why Mexico? I have no idea. Is Mexico great at making yeast and we're not? Came from Mexico. So we have Spain, India, Mexico, Canada. I think maybe something came from the US. I think the eggs did. I really looked at the carton carefully. I could not figure out. There's not a clue where they come from. All I know is that the carton's made from 100% recycled cardboard, and that's good news. So I'm going to leave you with this, with these things to think about. How try to. I do want to urge you to do one thing this summer. You're here with friends. You know, a lot of you came with friends. Go to the farmers market together. Buy some food and make a meal and sit down together. Find out the name of the farmer that you're buying it from and sit down to that meal and find that you're able to say, oh, you know, Phil Loomis grew this lettuce. You know, Rick did this beef, this wonderful hamburger I'm having. It came from Pecos. You know, you can sit down and you can actually easily identify where all your food comes from. And I really want you to have that experience because once you do, it really plugs you into this community. And that feels good, workable, and to me that feels like something worth going for, something that might even be sustainable. So thanks for being so patient. You didn't write a lot on your papers, but give them to me anyway, if you wouldn't mind, because I'd like to see what you did write. Thank you.